Hey everyone, my name is Jordan Levin and I'm a developer at Sparkbox. In this video, we're going to talk about how you can supercharge your PR review process by using Commit Curation. So let's get started. These are the things we're going to go over today. We'll talk about guiding principles on commit history, curating your commit history before reviews, the PR review process, and curating your branch commit history for main. Now, let's start by talking some of our guiding principles. At Sparkbox, these are our guiding principles. It's that we look to the commit history of a repository for context and as a documenter of the evolution of the codebase. We all take collective ownership of the code. No developer lives on an island. We get other teammates to review and merge our code. The approaches and techniques we'll talk about today are in service of these principles. Before we get started at looking at some techniques, let's briefly go over the life cycle of a feature branch. It starts here. A developer works on a feature. This is where a developer checks out a branch from main and makes their code changes in the form of commits. Next, the developer submits a PR on the remote. From here, we engage with other developers to discuss the approach, gather feedback, and make changes to improve the feature branch. Lastly, the code gets approved and merged into our main branch. Now we're going to touch on all four of these steps during our talk today. So let's go ahead and get started. By now, you should be aware of the power that is interactive rebasing. We're not going to go into great detail on the mechanics of how to use interactive rebasing. Instead, we're going to focus on the why. So why is the commit history of your branch before reviews important? Because information is our currency, and the commit history is information. Let's consider the PR here. Now this is quite a large PR. It's almost 2,000 lines changed. Now it might be tempting to click here and to just see all of the files changed, but this only shows me the end result of the PR. It doesn't give me context into how we got here. And unfortunately, it looks like all of these changes were made in a single commit. This means I don't have the ability to go through a PR commit by commit. Surely, the developer had a thought process that led to all of these changes, but none of that is reflected here or offered to me as a reviewer. The first thing that we can do to curate our commits is to define what they do. We do this by grouping our commits together based on an idea. What is it that this commit is doing? What is the idea that it serves? It's not about committing individual files at a time, it's about committing individual ideas at a time. And with those ideas, we can categorize what they're doing. Our style is to preface all subjects with a type that tells us what the commit is. This comes from a popular spec called conventional commits. These are some samples for our commit history. Notably, these are the ones that correspond to changes to production code. So here's our subject. Now add our commit message, under 50 characters to prevent being truncated by GitHub. If applicable, we'll add notes to the commit body. Notably, this is where you share valuable historical context as to why this change was made. Instead of using this space to tell us what you changed, tell us why and share context that would be useful to use as a reference in the future. Remember, Git tells us what you changed, so you don't need that information. Instead, think about it this way. If this change introduces a bug and someone runs a git blame, what contextual or historical information would be helpful to see? And lastly, a footer, just to reference the card you're working on. A reviewer must understand the thought process being changed. We all collectively own the code. That means that a reviewer shouldn't act as just a rubber stamp for a PR. Instead, the reviewer should understand what the thought process was behind the PR. And for the reviewer to truly understand the thought process, they frequently can't just skip right to the ending by viewing all of the changes. If you're a reviewer tasked with looking through a PR, does this commit that contains all the changes help onboard you as to what's going on? Surely the developer who made this PR didn't have just a single idea that captured the entire PR, or did they do everything at once? Instead, what happened is the developer likely had a lot of small ideas that encompassed the work. Maybe they did some unrelated work, like updating the dependencies in a PR template, then maybe they added a stub for an endpoint, then maybe they made a service, and then maybe they persisted some data from that service in the store, and then they used the service for a new feature. But when you erase that narrative by only representing the evolution in a single commit, your reviewer loses valuable context and insight. The reviewer is left only with your conclusion, but none of the steps that built towards that conclusion. A PR commit history, like a codebase commit history, should read like a story. The story guides them through the thought process and our approach. While simply skipping to the end works for small PRs, large PRs that involve multiple abstractions are impossible to fully digest simply by looking at the complete collection of changes. So what does that mean? Well, let's take a look at an example. I'm going to write a quick essay. And as with all essays, I need to start by writing my conclusion first because that's what we learned to do in school. Now that I know where I'm going to go, I need to write my intro. Okay, and now that that's done, I'm going to go back and start to write some body paragraphs. Now, this is the chronological order that a lot of people use when writing papers. But of course, we don't ask readers to read our paper in the order we wrote it. That would be nonsense. Going from the conclusion to the intro, it wouldn't properly guide the reader through the thought process of the author. Instead, the reader reads the story in an order that makes more sense. In this case, by reading the essay from the intro to the body paragraphs to the conclusion. If we're all in agreement that a reviewer should fully understand the thought process behind a PR, and that it's unlikely they can fully understand the process just by looking at the total changes, let's chat about commit curation. The best way to onboard your reviewer to your changes isn't always coupled with the chronology of changes you've made. But how can we modify our history and curate our commits? Of course, interactive rebasing. Interactive rebasing allows us to modify our own commit history. It's like an editor for our commits. With this tool, we can curate our commits to onboard the reviewer to our changes and minimize the amount of time they need to get up to speed. Take a look at my commits. This is the chronological order of commits. Now let's take a look at what's represented here and see if we can improve the onboarding experience for my reviewer. To start, I have a work in progress commit. Now that's probably not necessary to have for my reviewer to only see a partially working commit. And this style commit that fixes a typo, it looks like this is actually from a commit that fixes an issue that I caused in my own feature branch. That adds unnecessary noise for my reviewer. Next, in the middle of all of my work for a new feature, I have some dependency updates. This will read a little strange to my reviewer. They'll be going from commit to commit, and right in the middle of the work dedicated to standing up the feature, I divert and start updating dependencies. Again, this narrative could read clearer just by having the commits towards the start of the commit history for dependency updates. Next, a bug? Bugs are fine to represent if they're fixing an issue in main, but a commit that fixes an issue caused in my branch before anyone saw it? Does my reviewer care to see that I introduced a bug and then fixed it before they even started reviewing it? Does it add any important information? Probably not. Lastly, the ordering of these commits could be better. Since migrate service relies on migrate endpoint, we should add support for the endpoint first and then add support for the service. We as developers, we never have any lack of time whatsoever, right? Just kidding, we're always pressed for time. There's always a critical bug we need to fix or a new feature that we need to get rolling on. Curating your commits before a PR is reviewed will save your reviewer time by onboarding them to your changes more efficiently without sacrificing how effective their review is. Nobody benefits from developers blindly approving PRs without actually understanding the scope and rationale behind the approach. By taking the time to curate your commits before a reviewer reviews them, you are empowering them to do their best work by guiding them through your approach via your commits. And now, our commits are curated and ready for review. So let's talk about the review process as a reviewee. First, always rebase your branch before the review starts. If your branch is behind main and main contains changes that would influence the approach of your work, it's important to address that as early as possible. Consider this example where we're modifying the text of a file. In orange is our main branch and in blue is our feature branch. Here, you can see that our feature branch's basis is only the first commit where the text is hello. However, after we checked out our branch, the language is changed to Spanish. The problem here is that if our reviewer looked at this branch and approves it, we'll have to get another review after we've rebased since our approach would have to change. Instead, We should rebase on main before we submit our PR to resolve any changes in the approach before we get our reviewers' eyes on it. And as more code is merged into main, we should always keep our branch up to date with what's on main. A standardized PR template used in your repository enforces consistency between PRs submitted by each developer. Streamlining the process removes any confusion when it comes to reviewers acclimating themselves to the validation process. This is where we provide brief descriptions, link to related cards or design files, list the individual checks required, like checking that browsers have been tested, and that docs have been written, etc. Notably, it also contains a set of steps that can be used by developers to validate that the code works as expected. In this case, we can see that this PR has two series of checks. One is to make sure that the reviewer can replicate the bug on main, and the second is to make sure that the reviewer is able to validate the fix. These steps should be clear and specific and allow the reviewer to easily verify expected behaviors. After this, it's off to the reviewer. Now, this might seem like a weird thing to say. We've been talking so much about curating commits and using interactive rebasing to change the commit history and, in some cases, the contents of the commits before review. Why all of a sudden are we saying we should stop modifying history? Well, it is pretty simple. Here's the process we've talked about before. Developer codes, makes a PR gets approved and eventually merged into main. Throughout this process, there are really two periods where curating commits happens. The first is any time before a PR is reviewed, and the second is right before the PR gets merged into main. We curate our commits before the PR review starts reviewing our work because we want to onboard the reviewer to our changes, and by curating the commit history, we can make our intentions and thought process more clear. However, once this review starts, a reviewer is going to go through our commits one by one. But remember, curating commits is rewriting history. So if we were to modify the commits and rewrite history while it's being reviewed, our reviewer would have a difficult time tracking new changes in an updated commit history. Imagine trying to read a story as the story is being rewritten. For this reason, there's a lockdown period when it comes to rewriting history. This period starts after the PR is submitted and ends after the PR is reviewed. Notably, this doesn't mean commits can't be added like normal. The lockdown period is specific to using interactive rebasing to rewrite the history of our branch while it's being reviewed. If you change the history of your commits, then it's possible your reviewer might not see the changes. If they're reviewing your PR commit by commit, then unexpectedly modifying the commit history, like fixing up 2 commits or editing a commit, it might be disregarded since the changes you made were in commits that were already reviewed. Again, this doesn't mean that you can't make changes to your branch after it's being reviewed. You can, of course, add commits like normal. Instead, just add commits on top of the head of the branch without modifying history so a reviewer is made aware of them. Inevitably, changes will be requested. Maybe it's a change in approach, maybe it's to fix up some spelling errors. No matter what they are, organize individual changes into commits. Your reviewer will thank you, I promise. Here's why. Let's talk about making changes. Your reviewer will be sending you lots of change requests through your PR. So you read through them, you make all of the changes that address the various issues, and do what? You commit all of your changes in a single commit. Now you might be thinking to yourself, well, this is centered around an idea, right? The idea of fixing all of my PR feedback. Plus, eventually this will all be squashed before being merged in, so what does it matter? Well, the problem is that now your reviewer has to go back through all of their comments and cross-reference with the contents of your one large commit that addresses all their feedback. Now, this is not the best use of time. So how can we make sure that we address all of the issues, but minimize the time that it takes for our reviewer to verify we've addressed everything? Well, we make each change request as part of its own commit centered around an idea. Solve all of your linting errors in a commit. Fix a bug in another. Update docs in a different commit. You're utilizing the same mindset as before. You're making changes centered around an idea. The benefit here, though, is that now each update is represented in a single commit. This allows you to comment on GitHub with the SHA of the change, making it extremely easy for the reviewer to keep track of what changes have been addressed and which ones haven't. It also isolates changes based on idea to a single commit, meaning that if your reviewer's feedback was incorrect, you can easily use Git's revert feature to undo the contents of a specific commit. Plus, GitHub, among other cloud-based repositories, will automatically parse out the entire SHA and link directly to the change inside of the comments. This allows reviewers to quickly move from their own work to the PR and review and validate that the changes have been made and work as expected. And with that, we come to the review process as a reviewer. As expected, the process for the reviewer is less involved than the reviewee. As a reviewer, we need to prioritize PR reviews over our own work. This is because we want to embrace the continuous integration of our code by avoiding stale branches. If we are tasked with reviewing a PR but are slow to start reviewing it because we're working on our own cards, the branch will become outdated and require frequent rebasing. Plus, if the branch we're reviewing is a blocker for other cards, then we can slow down our team's velocity if the PR we are reviewing is preventing new work from starting. We have collective ownership of the code. We as reviewers should have just as much care about what we approve in PRs as the code that we write on our own. Now, I have nothing against approving PRs with "looks good to me," but a rubber stamp approval doesn't benefit the codebase, and making changes to it deserves our undivided attention. Take the time to go through the PR and give thoughtful feedback. But while you're submitting your review, remember that there's a person on the receiving end. Always assume they're intelligent and have the best of intentions. Now, that isn't to say that you shouldn't give critical feedback. You absolutely should point out where there are errors or better approaches. But also take the time to reinforce good patterns or interesting approaches when you see them. Telling a developer that you think part of their code could be improved is just as important as pointing out the things that you genuinely found interesting or inventive. And finally, we're at the end of our process. Our PR is reviewed, and all that's left is for us to merge it into the main branch. Previously, I mentioned that there are two periods when commits are curated. The first period was before a PR is submitted, and the second was after a PR is approved, but before it's merged into main. Now, you might be asking yourself, why do the commits in this PR need to be curated a second time? Consider this. How do you respond to people who ask how your day is going versus how your week is going? If someone asks you how your day is going, you'll probably provide a high level of detail since the scope of the question is defined relatively small. You might give an overview, talk about your morning, talk about what you had for lunch, what you worked on, and maybe what you did after work. But let's change the scope. What if someone asked about your week instead of your day? You wouldn't provide the same level of detail for a question where the scope is relatively large. And why not? Because adding that level of detail for a larger question would be unmanageable. The level of detail simply adds too much noise given the broadness of the question. With all this information, we possibly drown out the important details that do matter and make it difficult to get a clear, big picture. So how does this apply to Git? Well, let's say I have this PR with 5 commits. The context of this PR is only these 5 commits. The reviewer assigned to this PR is the audience, and as the audience, they're looking through these and only these 5 commits. These commits served their purpose of onboarding the reviewer to the PR and provided a level of detail that allowed the reviewer to hone in on these changes. However, once these changes are merged into main, the context switches. Now the lens that we're looking at is much broader. The granularity of the commit depends on its backdrop. When submitting PRs to stand up a feature, the backdrop is that feature. However, when those branches are merged into the main branch, the backdrop is now the entire history of the codebase. Remember, we want the commit history of our main branch to be a useful resource when looking at the evolution of our codebase. If we don't edit the level of detail representing in our commits between PRs and merging, the noise to signal ratio of our codebase commit history will make it unreadable. Instead, we squash our commits into ones organized by larger ideas that make sense to stand alone in the codebase, usually in 1 or 2 commits. We do this after the PR is approved, but before we merge it into main. Now, by doing so, we might lose some historical context that was previously represented in individual commits. But fortunately, the second curation process allows us to use the squash command to combine commits and edit the commit notes. In this example, we can see that a single commit is represented in main that is centered around a larger single feature. However, this commit is actually the product of 3 individual commits that were squashed together. All of the historical context and all of the notes are preserved in this larger commit body that is inspectable via a git blame or simply traversing the commit history. The final step in the PR process leads to a helpful and more refined commit history. So these are the 4 topics we covered today. We talked about how we can use interactive rebasing to curate our commits for PRs. We talked about how to set up your PR and document code change requests. We went over how to leave thoughtful feedback during the PR process. And lastly, we talked about how our commit curation should extend to not only how commits are viewed during the PR process, but how they're viewed during production over time. And that concludes our talk on commit curation. Thanks for watching, and be sure to visit sparkbox.com/foundry for more advice and insights from discovery to launch and everything in between.